Peace River Westlock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm thankful for this opportunity to speak on the motion before us today, and I want to indicate that I will be splitting my time with a member from Yorkton Melville. The motion declares that it is in the public interest to protect the freedom of conscience of healthcare professionals when it comes to medical assistance in dying, and that everybody has a freedom of conscience and religion under Section 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that a regime that would require healthcare professionals to make use of effective referral of patients would infringe upon freedom of conscience. And that number 4, the government should support legislation to protect the freedom of conscience of healthcare professionals. Mr. Speaker, it is the federal government's duty to provide legislation that protects conscience rights of medical practitioners. With respect to the rights of Canadians, it is also the government's duty to protect and preserve our healthcare system. Fundamental freedom of conscience is listed alongside other fundamental freedoms we also take for granted here in Canada, such as the freedom of religion, freedom of thought, freedom of belief, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association. Fundamental freedoms are not negotiable. They cannot be tossed aside if they are deemed by some to be inconvenient. Canada is not a dictatorship or a tyranny. Mr. Speaker, I know from comments made in this House and at committee that all members here are concerned about conscience rights. When Parliament has been faced with balancing conscience rights in the past, it has always strongly supported conscience rights. For example, in the Civil Marriage Act, it clearly states, "No person or organization shall be deprived of any benefit or subject to any obligation or sanction when exercising their fundamental charter rights of freedom of conscience." I believe that we can establish a framework that supports patient rights for end of life and supports conscientious objection. The problem is that Bill C-14 does not legally protect conscience rights. If C-14 comes into force, it will immediately put the charter conscience rights of the healthcare professionals at risk and ultimately undermine our healthcare system. Now, the government will argue that C-14 was amended at Standing Justice Committee this past week to prevent healthcare professionals from being compelled to participate in medical assistance in dying. The amendment made at committee states, "For greater certainty, nothing in this section compels an individual to provide or assist in providing medical assistance in dying." Let me be clear, Mr. Speaker. This amendment in C-14 at the Standing Committee offers no legal protection to healthcare providers who feel that any involvement in medical assistance in dying goes against their conscience and their profession. Just because C-14 presently states that nothing in the specific section of the Criminal Code can compel healthcare professionals, it doesn't mean that any other entity still can't compel or coerce a healthcare provider against their conscience rights. For example, an employer could insist upon it, or a provincial healthcare regulatory bodies could as well. Healthcare professionals have been clear that protecting their conscience rights means that healthcare professionals should never be required to refer patients, provide medical assistance in dying, be discriminated against for their beliefs or conscience on medical assistance in dying. During the Supreme Court of Canada hearings on the Carter case, the Canadian Medical Association expressed that any legislative scheme must legally protect those physicians who choose to provide this new intervention to their patients, along with those who do not. C-14 does not offer legal protection. At this committee stage, Conservatives put forward strong amendments to legally protect healthcare professionals' conscience rights, and they were rejected by the government. If C-14 passes without legal protections for healthcare providers' conscience rights, Canada will be the first jurisdiction in the world that has legalized assisted suicide without robust conscience clause for healthcare providers. It is also important to recognize that without federal government direction on conscience rights, Canadians and healthcare professionals will be faced with a patchwork approach, which is not what the Supreme Court of Canada intended. For example, the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario is insisting that an effective referral system. This poses an immediate problem for those doctors who are conscientious objectors and are forced to choose between a career and conscience when this legislation comes into effect. On Wednesday, the Senate heard testimony from the Coalition for Healthcare and Conscience, an organization and a coalition that represents 5,000 physicians, 110 healthcare facilities, and 60,000 staff in the healthcare profession. They expressed grave concern that C-14 offers no legal protection for conscience rights of healthcare professionals, and they were concerned that their healthcare professionals may reevaluate their career choice. And they stated, throughout our discussions with the provinces, we know that it is unclear whether in fact they will decide to legislate. In this legal vacuum, hospitals, colleges, provinces, healthcare authorities, nursing homes, and hospitals can create policies that will encroach upon the constitutional rights of caregivers. This will create chaos. For example, while one medical college, the one in Ontario, is requiring referral, at least 7 others have already indicated that they will not, end quote. Mr. Speaker, it is clear that a patchwork approach to issues like referrals and medical assistance in dying will take place. It is within this legal vacuum that healthcare professionals will face discrimination because C-14 does not legally protect conscience rights. This type of situation will only harm a society, but it will also harm a healthcare system. Healthcare professionals express that they have to make the difficult decisions to leave their professions if we fail. They will have to make the difficult decision to leave their profession if we fail to protect freedom of conscience rights. Dr. Sephora Tang, who is an Ottawa psychiatrist, shared with the Senate committee on Wednesday her concerns about the lack of protection in C-14. She said, "It is very difficult for me as a professional physician and psychiatrist to say that some of my patients I should be referring to medical assistance in dying with the whole issue of conscientious objection. It's almost as though my professional judgment has been stripped. If we do not have legislation that allows me to practice according to my conscience, the time that I have with my patients to work with them will be truncated, and I feel it was to their detriment and to the detriment of their families, their friends, and the patients that are left behind, and also to the individual healthcare professionals and the team members who work on this patient as well," end quote. Dr. Matthew Mellison, an emergency doctor from Stony Plain, Alberta, also expressed this opposition to medical assistance in dying when he said, "The act of helping a patient to find a physician to assist in suicide is nothing short of complacency in killing vulnerable people. As a physician, I am not aware of any medical condition where killing my patient is an effective treatment." Mr. Speaker, there are many more healthcare professionals who hold similar views and face ultimately between choosing for their conscience or their work. These healthcare professionals journey with those who are suffering and sick every day. They help patients end their lives. They help their patients with their end of their life, but they object to ending their life. The Hippocratic Oath rightfully recognizes this element of our nature. Healthcare professionals are to take an oath stating they will remember that there's an art to medicine as well as some science, and that the warmth, sympathy, and understanding may outweigh the surgeon's knife or the chemist's drug. Freedom of conscience for all healthcare professionals must be protected. Hope, a constituent in my riding, sent me an email recently stating, "Conscience rights are protected freedom in Canada and should not be violated." Saying this, it should be clearly stated that healthcare providers can refuse to perform or refer a physician-assisted suicide on the grounds of conscientious objective. Do not trample on the rights of one group for the perceived rights of another, end quote. A majority of Canadians agree with Hope. A recent Nanos research poll showed that 75% of Canadians agree that doctors should be able to opt out of offering assisted dying, compared with 21% of those who disagree. Even the Canadian Medical Association noted that approximately 70% of Canadian physicians do not want to participate directly or indirectly in assisted suicide. Freedom of conscience rights must be given a priority in the Charter. The government should strengthen C-14 by adding codified protections for conscience rights as anticipated in Carter, similar to recognition of conscience rights and religious rights in the Civil Marriage Act. This would be accomplished by adding an offense to intimidate or coerce healthcare professionals to take part directly or indirectly in assisted suicide or euthanasia. The government should also make it an offense to dismiss from employment or refuse to employ a healthcare professional if they refuse to take part directly or indirectly in assisted suicide or euthanasia. Mr. Speaker, if freedom of conscience rights for healthcare professionals are not protected, the rights of the few will trample over the charter rights of those who have dedicated their lives to helping us heal and live healthy lives. I hope the government will support this motion, ultimately act to legislate real protection for healthcare professionals on medical assistance in dying. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.